She told me to turn off the lights, but all I wanted was to see her one last time. The office was quiet that evening, the usual hum of printers and chatter replaced by a rare, almost reverent stillness. Only the soft glow of the desk lamps punctuated the darkness, casting long, gentle shadows across the polished floors. I had stayed late to finish a report, half dreading the empty silence but also secretly enjoying the rare solitude. That was when I noticed her, my boss, usually composed and commanding, leaning over her own paperwork, a small crease of fatigue between her brows. There was something different about seeing her in this light. Normally, she moved through the office with a graceful confidence, each step and gesture precise, almost untouchable. But now, with the late-night quiet wrapping around her like a soft blanket, I saw the humanity beneath the professionalism. The way her fingers traced over the papers, lingering for a moment before she picked up her pen again. The way she adjusted the cuff of her sleeve, as if the routine comforted her. I hesitated at the doorframe, pretending to focus on my own screen while my eyes drifted toward her. The warm glow of her lamp caught the highlights in her hair, softening the sharp angles of her face. It wasn't just beauty, it was familiarity and vulnerability, a quiet invitation to notice her beyond the title she held over me. I could hear the faint rustle of paper as she shifted, the subtle exhale as if carrying the weight of the day. When she looked up and caught me staring, her lips curved into a small, knowing smile. It wasn't teasing or flirtatious, just the acknowledgement of shared solitude, a recognition that we were both the only souls awake in the building. She made a casual remark about staying late again, the kind of line that sounded light but carried an unspoken fatigue. And I found myself responding before I even realized it, my voice softer, quieter, more attentive than usual. I could feel the subtle pull of curiosity and admiration tightening in my chest, a slow warmth that came from noticing someone fully, seeing not just the exterior but the moments that revealed who she was when no one else was watching. Every small movement, how she brushed a stray strand of hair behind her ear, the slight tilt of her shoulder, felt amplified in the quiet of the office. In that moment, I understood that the late hours weren't just about finishing work. They were about noticing, truly noticing, someone who had always seemed untouchable but was quietly human, quietly inviting me into a space where respect, empathy, and maybe something more could grow. And for the first time, I wanted to linger, not just for the work, but for the chance to see her, really see her. The office had settled into a hushed quiet, the kind that makes every small sound, paper rustling, the hum of the air conditioner, feel amplified. The city lights outside stretched across the windows in thin, golden streaks, softening the edges of the room. I was just about to gather my things when she glanced up from her desk, her eyes catching mine in a way that made me pause. "Turn off the lights," she said, her tone casual, almost a habit after long days like this. But there was a subtle undertone, a quiet challenge hidden beneath the surface of her words. I froze for a heartbeat, the light switched just inches away. Something in her posture, the way she leaned slightly against her desk with one hand resting loosely on the edge, suggested she was enjoying the small game we seemed to be playing. And then, without thinking, the words slipped out of me, "And let me see you first." Her eyebrow arched, just the slightest quirk, and a small, incredulous laugh escaped her lips. It wasn't mockery, there was warmth in it, amusement mingled with surprise. I could feel the room shift, as if the tension between us had quietly thickened, but in a way that wasn't uncomfortable. The playful exchange made the ordinary office space feel intimate, like we had carved out a small world for just the two of us. The dim light caught the subtle contours of her face, softening the angles that were usually so sharply professional. I noticed the gentle curve of her lips, the faint shine in her eyes, the way her hair fell naturally, not tucked into the rigid precision of daytime authority. Every small detail seemed magnified in the low light, the brush of her sleeve against her arm, the quiet sigh as she leaned back in her chair. I hesitated by the switch, hand hovering, but I could feel her gaze, steady and quietly playful, drawing me in. There was a rhythm to it, unspoken, that made the air between us feel charged without a single overt gesture. It wasn't about flirtation in a hurried or reckless sense, it was about noticing, appreciating, acknowledging the subtle humanity beneath the professional veneer. Finally, she shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips, and I flipped the switch. The office darkened, leaving only the glow of the city lights. The shadows played across her features, and I realized how much the world had contracted to just this moment, just this quiet intimacy. Even in silence, the connection between us had grown deeper, a delicate thread of curiosity and unspoken understanding. It was just the beginning. The kind of moment that lingered, quiet but electric, leaving me acutely aware of her presence, and of how much I wanted to see her, not just in the office light, but in every quiet shadow of the evening that followed. The office was nearly dark now, the harsh fluorescent glow replaced by the soft, golden shimmer of city lights spilling through the wide windows. Shadows stretched across the carpet, curling around the corners of desks, and the world outside seemed to move in slow motion. I could feel the quiet hum of the building beneath us, but inside this small corner of the office, time seemed to pause. She leaned against her desk, shoulders relaxed but not slouching, her silhouette outlined in the faint ambient light. I found myself unconsciously taking a step closer, aware of the small space between us, the almost imperceptible warmth radiating from her. It wasn't physical in any rushed sense, it was the comfort of presence, the kind of quiet proximity that makes ordinary moments feel charged. I noticed the little things, the way her fingers tapped softly on the edge of her desk, the slight tilt of her head as she observed the city lights, and the way her hair fell across her cheek. Each detail seemed to demand my attention, and yet I felt a strange restraint, a respect that tempered my curiosity. The tension wasn't urgent, it was slow, deliberate, and profoundly intimate. At one point, my hand brushed against a stray strand of hair that had escaped from behind her ear. She didn't pull away. Instead, there was a subtle acknowledgement in the slight shift of her posture, a quiet acceptance of the fleeting contact. I could feel the warmth of her presence pressing against my senses, the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the soft air of the office, creating a heady, unspoken familiarity. We shared the silence for a moment that felt longer than it was, each of us acutely aware of the other's breathing, of the small, unconscious movements that revealed comfort, hesitation, and curiosity. Her eyes occasionally flicked to mine, lingering just enough to communicate that she was aware of me, not just as an employee, but as someone who was fully present, fully seeing her. I realized in that quiet, lingering proximity that this wasn't about rushing toward confession or desire, it was about noticing, understanding, and savoring a connection that was growing in real time. Every glance, every small touch, every subtle shift of weight created a rhythm, a silent dialogue between us that words couldn't capture. And as the city lights danced faintly across her face, I felt a quiet certainty that these late-night moments weren't just incidental. They were the start of something delicate, slow, and profoundly human, a connection that would not be hurried, but nurtured in proximity, in attention, in the simple, electric presence of one another. The office felt suspended in time. Outside, the city shimmered in a quiet symphony of lights, but inside, the space between us seemed magnified, stretched by the weight of silence. We had moved closer without even realizing it, drawn together by the shared rhythm of the late night. She had pulled her chair near the desk, and I had followed, settling into the opposite chair. Neither of us spoke immediately. Words weren't needed yet, the unspoken understanding was already thick in the air. I noticed how her hands rested lightly on her lap, fingers brushing against one another as if to calm a subtle anxiety. Her shoulders were relaxed but not entirely at ease, the fatigue of the day lingered in the small tension across her back. I reached out, ever so slightly, placing my hand over hers. It wasn't a bold move, but a gentle reassurance. Her skin was warm, softer than I had expected, and the quiet contact seemed to anchor her, just as much as it steadied me. She glanced up, eyes meeting mine, and for the first time that evening, I saw her vulnerability laid bare, not through words alone, but through the subtle shift in her posture, the faint quiver of her lips, the way she leaned ever so slightly toward the touch. Slowly, almost tentatively, she began to speak, not about work, not about deadlines, but about the weight she carried quietly. Her voice was low, melodic, a hint of exhaustion threading through her words. She spoke of challenges no one in the office would ever see, moments of doubt, the pressure of always appearing composed, the isolation that often came with her position. I listened. Not offering solutions, not interrupting, just listening. Every pause, every subtle inhale, every fleeting glance felt charged with intimacy. The office, once a place of hierarchy and distance, had transformed into a space where honesty was possible, where trust could bloom in the dim light. Her confession wasn't dramatic or melodramatic, it was human, raw in its quiet simplicity, and profoundly moving. I could feel her shoulders relax slightly under my steady gaze, a silent acknowledgement that this moment was safe, that she could simply be herself. The warmth of her hand in mine, the soft exhale of her breath, and the gentle cadence of her voice created a cocoon around us, insulating us from the rest of the world. By the time she finished, there was a subtle shift, an unspoken bond forged in the dim glow of the office lights, a mutual recognition of humanity, trust, and connection. We weren't just boss and employee anymore. In that moment, we were two people, quietly leaning toward one another, navigating the delicate space between vulnerability and intimacy, realizing that the late hours had brought us something far more profound than productivity, a shared, unspoken understanding that would linger long after the office lights were turned off. The office had grown quieter still, the city outside casting a faint amber glow across the walls. Shadows from the building stretched inward, pooling in the corners like gentle reminders of the world beyond. We didn't speak at first, letting the silence settle comfortably between us, yet charged with an almost tangible tension. Each movement felt magnified, every subtle shift in posture, every blink, every soft exhale. I noticed her eyes first. They caught mine with a slow, deliberate intensity, lingering just a moment longer than socially necessary, as if she were searching for something in me, or perhaps simply acknowledging her own awareness. I could feel a subtle flutter in my chest, a delicate tug that spoke of curiosity and caution intertwined. Her glances were quiet, restrained, but they carried a weight far heavier than words could express. She shifted in her seat, leaning slightly forward, and I unconsciously mirrored her movement. Our proximity, though still measured, allowed for a closeness that wasn't purely physical, it was the closeness of understanding, of attention, of noticing the smallest things about one another. I could see the faint glimmer of city lights reflected in her pupils, highlighting the soft curve of her lips as she held back a smile, the gentle lift of her eyebrows at my slightest response. A moment passed where our hands nearly touched on the desk, separated only by a few inches. That near contact felt electric, a subtle current running through the air. Her hand twitched slightly, brushing against the surface of the desk, and I felt an instinctive urge to reach out, but restraint held me back. There was a quiet tension in the pause, the kind that said far more than action ever could. It was about presence, awareness, and the slow, deliberate enjoyment of noticing someone fully. Her gaze softened, and I caught the smallest flicker of vulnerability mingled with amusement. The weight of the day seemed to lift slightly from her shoulders as if the simple act of being truly seen made her more human, more approachable, more alive. I could feel the rhythm of our shared breaths, the subtle shifts in our postures, the way the dim light played across the lines of her face. Each glance, each micro-expression, wove a quiet, unspoken dialogue between us, speaking of attraction, curiosity, and a growing sense of emotional intimacy. In that space, time slowed. The rest of the office, the world beyond the windows, ceased to matter. We were suspended in a delicate balance of anticipation, respect, and fascination, each lingering glance building a tension that was never rushed, but simmered with quiet desire. I realized, with a soft, steady certainty, that this unspoken connection was far deeper than anything either of us had expected, and that the small, lingering moments like this could carry more meaning than any grand gesture ever could. We found ourselves near the window, the city sprawled out beneath us in a sea of shimmering lights. The office behind us had faded into shadow, leaving only the soft, golden glow that spilled from the skyscrapers outside. The world felt suspended, hushed, as though it had conspired to grant us this moment alone. She leaned lightly against the glass, her profile illuminated by the distant city glow. I could see the faint curve of her jaw, the delicate sweep of her cheek catching the light, and the subtle rise and fall of her chest as she breathed. The sight drew a quiet awareness inside me, a mix of admiration, longing, and an almost protective tenderness. I stepped closer, careful to respect the delicate space between us, yet unable to ignore the magnetic pull drawing me near. The air seemed thicker, charged with unspoken thoughts and emotions neither of us had yet dared to articulate. When she shifted slightly, her hand brushed against my arm. It was brief, almost accidental, but it sent a warmth spiraling through me, a tactile confirmation of the connection that had been quietly building over the past hours. Her eyes met mine, and I caught a vulnerability there I hadn't seen before, a hint of fatigue, a hint of hope, and a trace of something deeper, unspoken. I wanted to reach out, to offer comfort, but instead I let my hand hover near hers, careful not to impose. Yet the mere proximity, the shared space, felt electric. Every subtle movement, her shoulder brushing against mine, the slight tilt of her head, the gentle lift of her fingers, became a dialogue in itself. She spoke softly, almost as if the city could overhear, sharing a thought, a fleeting worry, a confession she hadn't voiced to anyone else. The words hung between us, fragile but significant, and I responded not with advice or solutions, but with steady attention, letting her feel heard, felt, understood. The intimacy of that moment wasn't physical alone, it was the slow, deliberate acknowledgement that we could exist fully in each other's presence, without pretense or barriers. Time seemed to contract. Every glance, every breath, every subtle touch carried weight, depth, and meaning. The emotional tension that had been building through whispered conversations, lingering glances, and quiet proximity now reached its peak, not explosive, but profoundly resonant. We didn't need to cross any line, the depth of feeling, the intensity of understanding, and the quiet acknowledgement of desire were enough to transform the ordinary office into a space of extraordinary connection. As we stood there, suspended between city lights and shadow, it became clear that something had shifted irrevocably. The late hours, the quiet moments, and the careful attentions had brought us to the edge of something significant. Not a rush, not a confession, but a shared, undeniable recognition of what we meant to each other, a delicate, simmering emotional peak that promised more without demanding it. The office had grown fully dark now, save for the faint amber glow of the city stretching across the windows. The hum of the building seemed softer, almost reverent, as though it, too, had recognized the quiet intimacy of the evening. We stood near the window, a comfortable distance apart, yet close enough that the air between us felt charged with understanding and a gentle warmth. She smiled softly, a curve of her lips that carried relief, appreciation, and a quiet fondness. It wasn't an over-the-top gesture, but a subtle acknowledgement of the connection that had grown through hours of shared silence, lingering glances, and unspoken confessions. I noticed the gentle rise and fall of her shoulders, the way her hands rested lightly on the edge of the glass, and the faint warmth radiating from her presence. Even in the subdued lighting, she seemed radiant, not in appearance alone, but in the quiet humanity that now felt shared between us. Our hands brushed almost accidentally as she thanked me for staying late, and a brief contact lingered in my mind, a tangible echo of everything that had passed between us. It wasn't about desire in a hurried or forceful sense, it was about presence, recognition, and the tender acknowledgement of what mattered most, connection. Each gesture, each glance, each soft exhale carried weight, shaping the evening into something far more meaningful than work could ever demand. She leaned slightly toward me, not in urgency, but in ease, and I felt an instinctive urge to mirror the closeness without breaking the delicate boundary that had been carefully maintained. Her eyes held a quiet light, a mixture of trust, curiosity, and the kind of vulnerability that comes from feeling truly seen. In that moment, all the walls of hierarchy, expectation, and restraint seemed to soften, leaving just two people, quietly present for one another. I realized that the late hours had gifted us something rare, a shared understanding that didn't need words or grand gestures. It was the comfort of someone noticing you fully, of feeling appreciated, and of knowing that connection could exist in its purest, slow-burning form. There was no rush, no leap toward something undefined, only the warmth of mutual acknowledgement, the lingering of eyes, the subtle weight of hands nearly touching, and the unspoken promise that these moments were the beginning of something delicate and profound. As we finally gathered our things and prepared to leave, the city lights still spilling across the office floor, I felt a quiet certainty. This evening, this unhurried closeness, had created a bond that would endure in memory, in glances, in fleeting touches. We walked out separately, but emotionally tethered, each step carrying the warmth, trust, and promise of something just beginning, something that would grow slowly, naturally, and beautifully in its own time. If this slow burn, age gap romance captured your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you won't miss our next story. Share your thoughts in the comments. What would you do if you found yourself in a moment like this?